And welcome to the latest installment of the Q Modules feedback sessions. The last call we had was a couple of weeks ago, but it feels like a significant amount has happened in those last couple of weeks. So look forward to sharing details on that. So the agenda is really to walk through progress updates since the last call, take a first look at what we're calling our roadmap projects, and in particular the modules roadmap. Talk about release updates and in the specifically releases that have happened since the last call, and a demo of an initial version of the central registry as well. So progress updates, Rog, maybe you want to sort of take on the progress updates here, because I think you actually drafted most of this content.
Yeah, sure. So we've got something out there that people have actually been trying, which has been excellent, and that's enabled us to find a bunch of rough edges, because of course we've just been testing with the registries we know about, and then everyone's like, oh, okay, I'll test on my own registry that I'm using, like for example GitLab, the AWS ECR, to name two in particular, and there are places where those registries do unexpected things, or things that we hadn't quite anticipated, and so that's been super helpful, getting a bit of a tight feedback loop there. And we've managed to make a bunch of changes that hopefully should make all that work much more seamlessly. So let's have the next slide, please.
Yep.
So there are a few changes that we've actually made in order to really facilitate our own testing, but I think this should be potentially quite useful for others too. We've got this mod registry subcommand. It's hidden for now, but you can, if you want a little in-memory registry to test out your modules, then you can just run qmod registry, and it's essentially an equivalent, much lighter weight equivalent to Docker run registry. So you can run your tests. So you know, if you want a registry and you haven't got Docker around, or then that's an easy way to do it. And as a reminder, actually, for other tests, the OCI registry repo that we're maintaining also has a very lightweight in-memory OCI server that you can use for the same thing, just fire it up in microseconds in your tests. We've fixed a load of subcommands that hadn't been updated to work with modules properly. And yeah, as I was alluding to earlier, there are a bunch of interesting edge cases in various repositories. That module, that OCI registry model, has actually got some interest from people outside of the Q world, and people are using that and actually reporting issues, and that's super useful as well, because we want that to be independently useful and independently of Q. And yeah, so there's a few interesting issues, like well, we expect that a head request and the get request might return the same headers, but no, in some cases you don't actually get a digest, so that's from a get request, but you do from a head request. Amazon ECR said, oh, you can't ask for more than 1,000 things, even though they're okay, they could cap that anyway. So just a few little things that most of the fixes are in now.
And Rog, just to interrupt, I'm sorry, this really has, and to thank those, I think I saw David joining the call, who have actually been trying this out against different backend registries. This is all being surfaced by people actually trying out this experimental version of Q modules with different OCI registry backends. So first of all, thank you to everyone who's doing that, and hopefully the responsiveness from our side in terms of tracking down these idiosyncrasies between the different backends is appreciated. And also what we're going to do, I think I mentioned it in one of the threads in Slack, is actually capture sort of the behavior of these different backends with integration tests, so that we don't regress, or that they don't regress versus Q effectively. So going forward, we should see more stability, but thanks to those who are actually trying it out.
Yeah, indeed, that's been absolutely super helpful. And so one thing that came out of this was the fact that actually we couldn't actually have a one-size-fits-all format for all registries, because different registries have different restrictions on the repositories that can be created and that sort of thing. So we've come up with this registry configuration file, which allows a little more detailed specification of the restriction, to work around some of the restrictions. So you can now specify what we call a path encoding, which specifies how a module path maps to the actual repositories and tags within that repository. And one out of the box is hashes tag, which says take the module name and hash it into a SHA 256 hash, and it just creates it as a tag, and so you only need a single repository for that. It's, from some points of view, it's not ideal because you don't actually get to see the module name as a separate repository, and it's this big hash. But it does mean you can use, for example, ECR, which only allows you to create one repository automatically, or rather you have to explicitly create repositories. It does mean you can use that as a registry backend now, which is really useful. So I probably won't demonstrate that here, but probably demonstrate that in the next call.
Yep.
That all seems to work quite well.
I think what we should also do as well is add documentation to alpha.qlang.org of these different modes. And we've talked about a command as well where you can effectively surface how a module path will be treated by the backend registry, or what commands will actually it's sort of like a dry run type equivalent of the commands that will be made, or the paths that will be accessed on the back end.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be pretty useful.
Yeah, and the docs will also therefore help. If we have such a command, I think it'll be a bit more obvious to people. Okay, given this module path, how is it then encoded on the back end? So hopefully we can surface that in the next couple of weeks, and then the docs will just sort of do all the work there for us.
Yeah. And the other thing that will be coming up soon, it's not there yet, is the ability for debugging purposes to actually get a debug log of all the requests that it's making, because when it's like super helpful just to actually have some log of the HTTP requests, because otherwise you have no idea what's going under the hood when things like Amazon are just returning EOF as nobody at all in the response. What's going on? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you and David had a bit of fun in a Slack thread on that one. So
absolutely, and I think that there are bugs server side, but whatever, we have to work around them somehow.
Yeah, and we talked about this earlier on, sort of offline, but this config file format in some ways is nice in that it unblocks people, but as you sort of alluded to, it might not actually be, quotes, the best thing in terms of how people want to store Q modules within a registry. And I think in that respect, we want to, it is in parallel to sort of creating fixes like this, also explore what best practice looks like when using your own custom registry, so that people don't get themselves into a bit of a tight spot where everything is, for example, within a single registry when perhaps they really didn't want that. And so I think, again, via documentation, we can sort of surface some of the issues around that. David.
Yeah, so maybe if we had some tooling around, for instance, listing the images in a given registry, then you get the friendly human readable status, and then you don't need to look at the hashes in the registry itself.
Yeah, Rog, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so that would be great if there was a standard entry point in OCI registries for listing images, which there actually isn't. There's a catalog endpoint which some implement, but there's no way to say list me all the repositories under this path. And for some global registries, then it's basically infeasible at the moment. So I mean, we might be able to special case it for some registries. That's something as yet to be. So listing all tags for a given module, fine. Listing all available modules, not so much, not so easy, I'd say.
Daniel.
I seem to recall that the OCI distribution spec doesn't have an endpoint for create a repo. So then for registry services like Amazon that don't create the repos for you automatically when you push a tag, when you push a manifest, what do they expose, like a non-spec API endpoint to create a repo, or how does it work then?
Yeah, I mean, there's like as well with Amazon. At any rate, there's an API for everything with Amazon. So you can go to their API and do it. You can use the command line tool to do it, but it's not part of the, as you say, it's not part of the OCI spec. And you can use this path encoding workaround to use a single repository for all your modules if you want.
And I'm guessing they don't have, like, is this kind of becoming an extra spec in any way, or is it not? It's like the Wild West.
At some point, yeah, I think there are people. There's a working group for it, but I have no idea what status. I mean, I think that working group has a much wider remit, so probably will be about 10 years down the line. We'll see.
I think this is where documentation, though, in terms of what Q can do, will sort of help. And David, with your help of sort of having kicked the tires on the AWS backend, and I'm totally forgetting. Oh, Max, who's already tried out things on the GitLab side of things. And I talked about the integration tests earlier, and what we're absolutely looking to do is document how these different backends differ in terms of their implementation, so that from an end user perspective, if someone's looking to try and decide, well, what registry should we use, they can at least look at that comparison chart and sort of see, okay, how are things going to impact us here from a Q perspective. David, just to pick up on your point though, as far as very interesting observation of how can we list the modules, etc., and the versions of modules that are in a given registry. As we'll come on to look at in the central registry demo, there is perhaps an alternative whereby a sort of a front, if you like, in front of a company, let's just call it a company OCI registry, can actually provide that. And kind of to Daniel's point, we can sort of, with such a custom front to an OCI registry, we can also then provide an extended API that the Q command can use in that situation. So even though the backend itself might not support it and might have to have encoded names, etc., then we can effectively reverse that via some sort of back end, front end, for want of a better phrase, that we can, and I'd look to share a few more details on this on the next call actually, but maybe the demo of the central registry will help to sort of give some idea of what that might look like as well. And particularly, for example, serving of documentation is something that then ends up being possible via that kind of setup. Cool. Okay, thanks, Rog. Now I need to, I'm sorry, just do a whole load of screen jigging around as I do a share tab of the modules roadmap first cut. Now, can someone just signal to me whether, Daniel, does that look okay to you? Great. Okay. Thanks, everyone. And this is, if it's not big enough, apologies. So what's, I'm just going to collapse these down for now. There was a discussion that we started in the Q issue tracker, in the Q project a couple of days ago, talking about how we are planning to improve our communication via the open source project. Essentially, there's a number of questions that are raised at the top of that discussion, motivating questions as to why we think we need to do things a bit differently to improve communication. And one of those is that sort of it's unclear to people what the focus areas of the project, the main focus areas of the project are. And within those focus areas, what the priorities are. And so modules being sort of a key priority area that we've talked about in the past, key focus area, we want to see experiment with how we can actually improve our communication of what we're actively doing, what's prioritized or what's planned from a modules perspective. And so that's why we'll sort of send around a link just as a refresher at the end of this. The discussion explains in a bit more detail how we're structuring these sort of roadmap projects. This is the one for modules. So here, what you can see, and it's a tiny bit clumsy to my mind that we have all of the backlog issues showing here, because it sort of creates a bit of scrolling going on, and it slightly detracts from what is planned, in progress, and done. And done in some respects is not so good, in that done is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as we do more, and we're sort of going to need to apply some filters. So you can sort of see there are some rough edges here in how we're actually presenting this. And our plan as well is also to try and look at some of these things as we refine our approach to communicating these roadmaps, is talking about how these things will happen over time as well. For those familiar with GitHub projects, there is also the concept of iterations, which you can sort of think of as being like sprints within a roadmap, in this case, the modules roadmap. For now, we don't have any such sprints at all that we're doing within modules. It's really, we're at this experimental phase of modules where we're trying to prove, for want of a better phrase, the proposal that we have around modules via an experimental implementation. Down the line, it might well be that we introduce iterations. We're not doing that for now. But this is really, and we're going to be looking to improve this over the course of the next few weeks, our means of trying to communicate to everybody what it is we're working on right now, what is planned, and where others want to be involved, also using this as a way of orchestrating and organizing that planning as well. So we do need to refine these things, but here you can see we've got the QLangQ repository where all of the issues, and we've really started to ramp up the number of issues we're creating around modules now. There's basically issues for every bug that we have found so far, a number of the features, for want of a better phrase, of modules that we could implement in the future. And as promised, we want to update the V3 of the modules proposal to really mirror what it is we're implementing via the experimental releases that we're sharing with folks now. So expect to see more of this. We'll talk more to these roadmaps on coming update calls and really use this as the basis once we're able to sort of refine some view that says what has changed since last time. We're just trying to work out the rough edges of GitHub projects. So if anybody has any good experience with using GitHub projects for sort of showing progress since the last thing, we'd love to hear from you and find out what worked for you. Roger's talked about the OCI repo, which is within that is the OCI registry Go module that we have open sourced, and that is, Roger, I think it's someone on the Docker project who started showing some interest in the module itself, unless I'm mistaken.
It's possible. I actually haven't looked up where he works.
Okay,
but he's fairly deeply involved in the OCI community.
Yep. So there we go. So great. So it's great if there are others who have experience and interest in in making the OCI spec sort of more a reality via a reference implementation. Maybe this is a good module to actually be getting involved with on the Go side of things. So here we don't have anything active. We would also, because we're lumping this as well as part of the modules planning, because it's so core to our implementation, that we also have it. We're capturing issues within the OCI repo here as part of our project planning. So I think that is that on that side of things. Let me quickly do a bit more release updates. I now need to share another tab. Sorry, this is going to get very boring for everybody. There we go. That wasn't too painful. We've really covered this already in what Roger's talked about, but there have been 2 releases, both of them pre-releases since the last call. Alpha 1, which, as Roger said, was that initial cut of experimental version of module support. The modules tutorial that we actually gave a demo of, that's sitting on alpha.qlang.org. Separately, alpha.qlang.org will very shortly be promoted to just qlang.org. And a first cut of the modules reference as well. We had, rather interestingly, a config-related error that caused us to have an abortive Alpha 2 release. Slightly ironic that the Q project should have a config-related error when cutting a release, but there we did. And so Alpha 3 was then the second version that we released since the last call. Roger's talked about these things in terms of the changes since last time. So I think actually this sort of talking about the releases is sort of useful because it's sort of like a release view on things since the last call. But in that respect, I'm just going to, guess what, share another tab here. And another way in which we're actually using GitHub projects is to do our release planning. So here we are looking at a view of the version 0.8 release series. There's a backlog here of things. The backlog really represents things that have to be in the final v0.8.0 release. And they sort of really need apportioning to the releases, the pre-releases that might happen up to that point. You can see we're already planning for Alpha 4 in this situation. And we're also sort of speculatively looking ahead to what will be in the release candidate, as in, and you can see here for the actual release itself that we do need to have a write-up of v3 of the modules proposal. So again, we're trying to get a bit better at signaling what releases are upcoming, what are going in those releases. And from the other perspective of working backwards and sort of saying what has to be in by the time we get to v 0.8.0, for example. One thing that's not sort of overlaid on the top of this is when we consider the modules proposal. And by definition, that's sort of going to be after the v0.8.0 release. That does not mean, however, that when we release v0.8.0, that modules proposal will be accepted. Everything will still be experimental at that point. It'll just be that that release is sort of graduated to being stable release, but with experimental parts of it. And so it's likely that after the 0.8.0 release, we will then start to properly consider, okay, what does v3 of this proposal look like? How are folks getting on with the experimental implementation that we've got out there? Does it feel like we should accept this? Yes or no? So that's the plan going forward. So now, again, sorry, a bit of window jiggling. Daniel, I can move over to you for a demo of the initial version of the central registry, please, so I don't have to share any more screen.
Okay, let me share my screen. And I am also on a single screen, so I'm going to rely on Paul to let me know if there's any questions or hand raises and so on. So I want to show the central registry. And what that means is registry.q.works. Now, this is not really ready to be announced or to be used by others, but it's sort of, it's on the way to being ready. So I want to show what we have so far. So right now, the web UI is fairly bare bones. There's no auth that we do ourselves, meaning we don't store any passwords. We do logins via GitHub. So if I went on the website, this is what a user would see. And this is the auth flow. We ask for very little to be able to log into the registry via GitHub. Personal user data, only the email address, and then only read-only access to see what orgs and teams you're part of. And this will be useful for being able to tell what authorizations you have to certain namespaces, if you will. But otherwise, there's no access to your account that's like read, write, or any access to your private code or anything like that. It's only in terms of your account.
Just briefly, this is a very, I think it's actually an identical level of access to that requested by companies like Tailscale, where they use read-only access to your orgs and teams as really a means of helping from a UI perspective. I think Namespace Labs are the same. From a UI perspective, to help make suggestions on places where you might want to publish modules from, for example.
Yep. So ignore the fact that I am somehow a member of 3,000 organizations. So if I authorize, I get called back. Haha. Of course. Interesting. I tested this half an hour ago and it worked. Welp. This happens sometimes. Oh, second time worked. Okay. And you can see the alert just fired there on my email. Amazing. Demos always go so well. So what I can do now is I've got a module that I want to publish. So the first thing I would do is enable the Q experiment. And you can see what the module looks like here. It's github.com/mvdan/test repo. This test repo is real. It is a GitHub repo that I own under my account. It's a private repo. The contents don't actually matter in this context because we only want the repo to exist to be able to tell who owns the repo and whether it's public or private. But otherwise, the contents that you publish is the contents on disk. It's not like Go where you publish by pushing to the repo. In our case, we push what is on disk, kind of like NPM or other package managers. So the first thing I would need to do is log in, because I did log in on my browser, but I would need some sort of token to then be able to publish from my command line from my laptop. So if I run this, I can open the link given here, which is an OAuth device flow with a user code. And this is similar to what might happen if you used, for example, GitHub's CLI to do a login on your laptop. It's basically the same flow. So if I open that, that works because I'm already logged in on the browser. It basically authorizes the device login via the browser. And then it stores an access token here. Never mind the fact that it's right now it's a plain text JSON file. This will be improved, but for now this works. And then what I can do is I can publish a version. So to prove that this works, let's prove that this works. So here's my foo.q. And this is what I'm publishing. And then I can do qmod publish version 0.0.11, for example. This takes a couple of seconds. And now it's published. So I want to show you a few things. If I go, and again, ignore that the web UI is fairly basic right now, but you can see a couple of versions that I've published here. And then what I can do is I've got another module here that imports this test repo and then package foo, and then just uses that value as part of some output. It's very, very simple. So if I do q export, this will fail because in my qmod module.q, there's no dependencies, and there's nothing in user package or anything like that. So there's no, it doesn't know where to find that import yet. But if I, again, enable the experiment and I run qmod tidy, and then I look at my module.q again, it's like Go in terms of when you tidy the module, if there's a dependency that's missing, given your imports, it looks up what the latest semver of that module is. And in this case, I just published 0.11, so that is the version. And if I do q export, it works because the tidy already downloaded it, so it's cached. So this is immediate, right? And this is what I just published. So it does work end to end, barring that minor bug I just uncovered. Yep.
Richard just asked a question, where is it cached?
It's a good question. So we, let me see if I can remember. So we have a command called qhelp, and one help section is environment. So we have two directories. One of them is for configs, such as, for example, that logins.json that I showed earlier. So in my case, I'm on Linux, so it would be here or here. And then the caches, like, for example, downloaded modules would be here, depending on your OS. So I think we should be able to do, yep, there we go. So you can see the downloads for the zip archive, which are basically, sorry, the downloads for the module archive, which are basically a zip archive, the module.q file, and some other metadata files. And then there's a different cache directory structure for the actual extraction of the zip. Was there another question? Sorry.
Please, Richard.
Very cool. This is great. I think this will help decrease the number of the size of the repository, because before we had to check into source code the Q mod folder.
100%. Yeah, that's one of the key goals, because also the management of that q.mod pkg directory structure is entirely manual. And so, yes, abstracting that effectively to a cache has benefits in terms of not having to cart around lots of files. It also means we can be a whole load smarter within the Q command as what actually needs to happen or not, and that can be cross-project as well. So just like the Go module cache, the module cache is, as you can see here, per user. Doesn't have to be, but by default it is. And so for all of your Q projects, if they share the same dependencies, then they all share the same cache if you want them to by default, and so you only download. Let's take github.com mvdan test repo v11 once. I think we saw some other question coming through. Richard, presumably that answers your question, but please shout if not. Has the QMod tidy also populated? Sorry. Yes, please go ahead.
About, oh, sorry. Did you mention my name?
Oh no, I beg your pardon, Richard Bonner Peng. Just after.
Oh, sorry, I just realized there's two Richards. Okay, my apologies.
Sorry, I hadn't appreciated that. All the Richards today. Richard Wilson, apologies. The other Richard, hopefully that answered your question. I think just to vocalize Jonathan Matthews' question, has the QMod tidy also populated the q.mod, or is it read directly from the cache dir on each evaluation? Yes, QMod tidy, as Roger says, updates the q.mod module.q file. A good place to answer, to also discover a bit more about this is the Q modules tutorial, sorry, is what I was going to say, where we do talk about this in a bit more detail. I think we also want to publish a bit more detail about how, for example, to use the registry config file. We might even have a couple of how-tos on that on alpha.qlang.org. Daniel, just FYI, you're still screen sharing. Just yeah, cool.
I know.
Okay, good. And I forgot the other point I was going to make there. So Daniel, go for it.
I was just going to very briefly mention, it sounds like what I demoed is fairly easy because we've demoed this flow before with a local registry or a dummy registry. So it almost seems like there's no changes. But the big difference is that the central registry does auth and OZ, right? So it worked in this case because I used github.com/my username/a repo that I own. But if I try to publish to, for example, one of Paul's repos, which I don't think I should have access to, and I try to publish something there, that gives me a forbidden error, right?
Yep.
So that is why this GitHub integration is useful, because I'm not Paul, and Paul hasn't given me access to publish modules under his name, right?
Yep, correct. Jonathan just had a quick follow-up question. He said, but it's not placed the module's contents in q.mod. Correct, yes. That effectively, exactly as Roger replies, is sort of akin to vendoring, and you don't need to do vendoring. Vendoring is something that we might well support down the line. Go does it, for example, where you deliberately want to carry around the dependencies with you, but that's sort of like a slightly special case. And folks who are using OCI registries in the first place almost certainly don't need to, because the registry itself likely already contains all the dependencies. So you'd sort of be duplicating a whole load of modules in some situations. David had a follow-up question. Will you guys be able to provide some community maintained modules like Kubernetes? That is an excellent question, David. And that is something we will be talking about more on the next update call, because that very much is the thinking. And we're going to start using the central registry ourselves to try and do a bit of road testing on that. And then also encourage others to sort of chip in with things that they would like to see published on the central registry as well, and maintained on the central registry. Again, this is one of the this is part of the raison d'etre for the central registry in the first place, is that there should, especially for public modules, be a, I don't want to say a single place, but a well-known place, let me call it that, for things like exactly what you're talking about, David, the generated version of the Kubernetes configuration files, or to take one of my favorites, which is the GitHub Actions schema file, which exists in Schema Store as a JSON schema, but really we would just like to consume it as a Go schema, oh goodness, Q schema, excuse me, and pull it from the central registry. Apple kicked off one like this too. If we wanted example PKR Pantry, that I will take a look at. Thank you, Richard. Yes, that kind of thing. But via the central registry as well, we'll also be able to as Daniel talked about, not just do public things as well, but also private modules. And that was a sort of a key design goal of how we do how we think about configuration and modules for configuration, because principally when you come to use configuration, it is almost always private. The schemas themselves are public, and so we needed the central registry to serve that dual purpose. Hence, that's Daniel sort of demoing a private version of a Q module by the central registry. It obviously also supports public versions. But David, excellent question. Richard, thank you very much for the example. We'll look to share a bit more of that on the next update call with a couple of demos possibly as well, if we can squeeze them in before the next call. Happy to take any more questions, because I don't have, if I can just try and do one last screen share, is really to just round out that piece on the central registry and say that we're opening up invites real soon now. If you're interested in being an early tester of the central registry, let us know. Happy to extend even earlier invites to beta testers. And also, David, to pick up on a point that you talked about earlier on about how actually you could sort of list perhaps all the Q modules that exist in a backend. This is something that hopefully we'll be able to demo next time as well, is like a very initial version of how the central registry can document modules that exist within the central registry. And if you squint hard enough, that's sort of one way that relies on being able to list the contents of what are in the OCI registry behind it. And so if we look at other deployed versions of the Q registry that is the central registry, then you can sort of achieve a similar kind of thing. Yeah, perfect. Richard Bonifeng, thank you. Thank you for all your interest in modules since I think we the first commit started landing in the Q repository. And you'd be delighted to follow up with everyone here as well. All the Richards interested. Thank you. I think at that point, I'll just stop and see if there are any additional questions, but thanks for all the questions that have been asked so far. If anybody has any others, please go for it now. We'll obviously continue to update in the modules channel on Slack. And also we'll look to probably create an announced discussion on an announced issue on GitHub, much to sort of mirror the project updates that are happening on the roadmap. Thanks, David.
I don't have any questions on modules per se, but I definitely wanted to take the option to come and join for office hours if that's on the table. But if this is meant to be more module Q&A, that's no sweat by me.
Richard Wilson, happy to sort of drift into an office hour session. We might sort of just stop recording to round out the module session itself, but happy to drift into that for anyone who would like to stay on. Anybody else got any sort of modules related questions that they wanted to cover right now?
I have one question on that.
Please, yeah.
I noticed from some documentation that we've just added to Alpha that we mention that we have the intention to support the current concept of vendoring for some period. I'm wondering if we've got any steer about the long-term suitability or presence of that feature in the current, where it's currently sitting inside Q.mod. Is that something that will come to an end at some point, or what?
That is a good question. Rog might be able to get my back, watch my back on this one here when I say that effectively the use of modules is mutually exclusive with Q.mod PK. No, it's not. I beg your pardon. I will stop talking and let Rog talk about that. Rog can give the answer, but I think we have one thing to just briefly add before Rog gives the proper answer, is that the concept of QMod vendor a la GoMod vendor is something we likely want to support. What exactly that looks like is unclear right now. Whether that QMod vendor would vendor into Q.mod/PKG, TBC, to be honest with you. We sort of leave the door open that. So with that sort of preface out of the way, I'll let Rog actually give the correct answer to what was your original question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see the PKG stuff as a kind of as an interim step for people that already are using that, and I think from what I thought about it is that vendoring is probably going to be a little different from that. I might even use a vendor directory instead, because I think that PKG user and gen are probably in the long term going to go away, because they're not that at the moment. You can have a hybrid of those and modules as long as there's no ambiguity between the two. But so vendoring, certainly in the Go sense, is a vendoring of all your dependencies. So you can't be both in module mode and vendor mode at the same time. And I think from some points of view that actual mode is somewhat problematic. But lots more investigation still to be done. And I think in general, like a vendoring feature will be designed as such, and not just grandfather in the current scheme.
I tend to agree. And then just to touch on the point about generated code, that's something we're actively thinking about as well. We do have this compatibility with existing generated code for now, but we're actively thinking about what that needs to look like in the future. And on previous modules update calls, we talked about some of the aspects that are involved with that. And again, we look forward to sharing more on that in the next few weeks. Got KubeCon EU that's in Paris on the 19th of March or 20th of March, 20th of March, I think. We're looking to get a number of these things live in experimental form before then. So yes, look forward to sharing more on that in the coming weeks with folks. And of course, Kubernetes fits into that space when it comes to generated code. Hence David's question about will there be sort of public versions of pre-generated versions of Kubernetes and other things available, and how does that relate to the central registry? We'll look to cover that in the next few weeks as well. No other questions? In which case, we'll look forward to seeing everybody in a couple of weeks' time, else in the modules channel on Slack. I will stop recording now.